Was Mata Hari really a spy?
When Dutch-born Margaretha Zell MacLeod, 1876–1917, was arrested in Paris on February 13, 1917. There was scant hard evidence that this woman, known throughout Europe as Mata Hari, was actually a spy for the Germans during World War I, 1914–18, but there was plenty of evidence that she had long consorted with the enemy and had been paid by them, but for exactly what was never discovered. Nevertheless, the testimony heard by the jury over 2 days in July in a closed Parisian courtroom was enough to convince them that this former exotic dancer, who could count as her lovers a who's who of European men, was, in fact, a spy. She was sentenced to death at age 18, the result of a matrimonial advertisement. She married a middle-aged colonial captain in the Dutch army, John Rudolph Campbell MacLeod. He was posted to duty on the island of Java, where his young and beautiful wife, now 21 years old, learned not only the Malay language, but native dances as well. Her Javanese friends named her Mata Hari, meaning the Eye of the Dawn. Upon returning to Holland, Mata Hari secured a separation from her husband and moved to Paris, where she enjoyed a life of excess and soon became known as an exotic Hindu dancer. She performed throughout Europe, all the while engaging in liaisons with powerful and wealthy men. In 1914 she moved to Germany, where she is believed to have been trained as a spy in Antwerp. With World War I on, Mata Hari returned to Paris. She was permitted to enter France since she owned property there and was a citizen of neutral Holland. She renewed her ties with men of influence and in that capacity collected information for the Germans. The Allied nations kept a close eye on her, and, suspecting her of espionage, set a trap for her. She became a double agent. The French sent her to Spain to work, but there she reportedly met regularly with German intelligence agents. When the Germans ordered her back to Paris, Allied officials, having intercepted a German cable for her, awaited her return. They arrested Mata Hari, who was found in possession of a check from the Germans. At her trial, a report compiled by the French and holding Mata Hari responsible for the deaths of some 50,000 Allied soldiers, was brought into evidence. She was killed by firing squad on October 15, 1917, the war still more than a year from ending.
What was the Embargo Act?
On December 22, 1807, President Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, signed the Embargo Act, prohibiting ships that were destined for foreign ports from leaving the United States. The legislation had been drawn up in an effort to pressure France and Britain, which were then at war and had been seizing U.S. merchant ships to prevent each other from receiving American goods. The situation began after the French Navy was crushed by the British under Admiral Horatio Nelson. 1758–1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, October 1805. French ruler Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, turned to economic warfare in his long struggle with the British, directing all countries under French control not to trade with Britain. Its economy dependent on trade, Britain struck back by imposing a naval blockade on France, which soon interfered with U.S. shipping. Ever since the struggle between the two European powers had begun in 1793, the United States had tried to remain neutral. But the interruption of shipping to and from the continent and the search and seizure of ships posed significant problems to the American export business. The Embargo Act was an attempt to solve these problems without getting involved in the conflict. But the effort failed. The embargo made sales of U.S. farm surpluses impossible. New England shippers protested the act and were joined by Southern cotton and tobacco planters in their opposition. Nevertheless, the embargo remained in effect for 14 months, during which the American economy suffered and many ships resorted to smuggling. In 1809 Congress passed the Non-Intercourse Act, which limited the shipping embargo to France and Britain. All other foreign ports were again open to U.S. ships. 3 years later, the United States was drawn into the conflict, fighting the British in the War of 1812–14.
Why was the Dred Scott decision important?
The decision in the case of Dred Scott pronounced the Missouri Compromise 1820 unconstitutional and served to deepen the divide between North and South, helping pave the way for the Civil War, 1861–65. In the mid-1800s Dred Scott, c. 1795–1858, who had been born into slavery in Virginia, tried to claim his freedom on the basis that he had traveled with his owner, a doctor. In Wisconsin and Illinois, where slavery had been prohibited by the Missouri Compromise. By the compromise, Congress decided to admit Missouri as a slavery state and Maine as a free state, and declared that the territories north of the 36th parallel, present-day Missouri's southern border, were free, with the exception of the state of Missouri. After a lifetime of slavery, Dred Scott sued Missouri for his freedom in April 1846. The case, which hinged on Scott's travels in free territories in the North, went through 2 trials. The second was granted due to a procedural error in the first. In 1850, at the conclusion of the second trial, a Missouri jury ruled Scott a free man based on precedents that indicated residence in a free territory or state resulted in emancipation, regardless of the fact that Missouri itself was a slave state. John F. A. Sanford, the lawyer for Scott's owner, immediately appealed the decision before the Missouri Supreme Court, where a pro-slavery judge reversed the ruling, rescinding Scott's freedom. But the case was not over yet, because Sanford had filed the court papers under his own name rather than that of Scott's former owner, the case of Scott v. Sanford, because of a filing error. The case is also rendered as Scott v. Sanford, took an interesting twist. Scott hired a new lawyer who was able to get the case before the federal court. Sanford had moved to New York, and since the appellant, Scott, and the registered defendant, Sanford, were now residents of different states, the case came under federal purview. In 1854 a circuit court in St. Louis again heard Dred Scott's case, but his freedom was again denied. This decision was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which began hearing the case in 1856. In March 1857 the Supreme Court, which had a Southern majority, ruled that Scott's residence in Wisconsin and Illinois did not make him free, that a black, a Negro descended from slaves, had no rights as an American citizen and therefore could not bring suit in a federal court, and that Congress never had the authority to ban slavery in the territories. Dred Scott died the following year.
When was the Interstate Commerce Commission formed?
The Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, was established by Act of Congress in 1887. The agency is responsible for regulating the rates and services of specified carriers that transport freight, goods, whether raw or finished, and passengers between states. Its jurisdiction, expanded by subsequent acts of Congress, includes trucking, bus services, water carriers, expedited delivery services, and even oil pipelines. The regulatory agency, the nation's first such body, was born out of necessity in the late 1800s. As farmers in particular charged the railroads with discriminatory freight practices, with rail lines crisscrossing the nation, the question of who would control rates and monitor practices had become an increasingly difficult one to answer. Many states, particularly in the Midwest, set up their own regulatory boards. But because the rail companies operated between states, enforcing state laws on them proved cumbersome and impractical. Meanwhile the railroads, operating without the purview of any effective regulatory body, set their own standards and practices, which resulted in many abuses. In an 1877 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, in the case of Munn v. Illinois, the authority of the state boards to regulate the railroads was upheld. But less than a decade later, in the case of Wabash, St. Louis and Pacific Railway Company v. Illinois, the High Court invalidated its earlier decision and proclaimed that only the U.S. Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. Citing Section 8 of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, 1790, which states that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And among the several states, and with the Indian tribes, the Interstate Commerce Act was passed in 1887. Setting up the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the interstate railroads. The agency's purview was later expanded to include all ground and water carriers that operate on an interstate basis. In addition to controlling rates, the agency also enforces laws against discrimination. The ICC's authority was strengthened by congressional legislation including the Hepburn Act, 1906, and the Mann-Elkins Act, 1910.
How did the textile industry begin?
The large-scale factory production of textiles began in the late 1700s, becoming established first in Great Britain, where a cotton spinning machine was invented in 1783 by Richard Arkwright, 1732 to 1792. Spinning mills were introduced to the United States in 1790 by English-born machinist and businessman Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835. The 21-year-old had worked as a textile laborer for more than 6 years in an English mill where he learned the workings of Arkwright's machine, which the British considered the cornerstone of their booming textiles industry. Laws prevented anyone with knowledge of the mill from leaving the country. In 1789 Slater, determined he could recreate the spinning mill and eager to seek his own fortune, disguised himself to evade the authorities and leave the country, sailing from England for American shores. Arriving in Providence, Rhode Island, he formed a partnership with the textiles firm Amey and Brown. Slater began building a spinning mill based on the Arkwright machine. This he did from memory. The spinning mill was debuted December 20, 1790, in the village of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where the wheels of the mill were turned by the waters of the Blackstone River. The machine was a success and soon revolutionized the American textiles industry, which previously relied on cottage workers, the putting out system, to manufacture thread and yarn. Slater's innovation, which would earn him the title Father of the American textiles industry, spawned the factory system in the United States. By 1815 there were 165 cotton mills in New England, all working to capacity. The early mills were not large-scale, however, and for a time after Slater's introductions, New England mills and merchants continued to rely on home workers to weave threads, now produced by the mills, into cloth. In 1813 the Boston Manufacturing Company opened the first textile factory, where laborers ran spinning and weaving machines to produce woven cloth from start to finish. The advent of machinery had given rise to the factory system, and laborers were shifted from working in their homes to working in factories, while native New Englanders continued to provide the labor for the textile industry for the next 2 decades. An influx of immigrants in the mid-1800s provided the hungry manufacturers with a steady supply of laborers who were willing to work for less money and longer hours. Within the first 3 decades of the 1800s, New England became the center of the nation's textiles industry. The region's ample rivers and streams provided the necessary water power, and the commercial centers of Boston and New York City readily received the finished products. Labor proved to be in ample supply as well. Since the mill machinery was not complicated, children could operate it and did. Slater hired children ages 7 to 14 to run the mill. A practice that other New England textile factories also adopted. The Jefferson Embargo of 1807, which prohibited importing textiles, also aided the industry. New England's mills provided the model for the American factory system. Slater had brought the Industrial Revolution to America.
Why was the introduction of plastic important to industry?
Pioneered in the early 1900s, plastic, which is any synthetic organic material that can be molded under heat and pressure to retain a shape, affected every industry and every consumer. As a malleable material, plastic could quite literally be molded for countless uses, both for the production of goods and as a material in finished goods. In 1909 Bakelite plastic was introduced, and over the next 3 decades the plastics industry grew, developing acrylic, nylon, polystyrene, and vinyl, polyvinyl chloride or PVC, in the 1930s, and polyesters in the 1940s. The applications seemed endless, from household items such as hosiery, clocks, radios, toys, flooring, food containers, bags, electric plugs, and garden hoses, to commercial uses such as automobile bodies and parts, airplane windows, boat hulls, packaging, and building materials. The space industry and medicine have also found critical uses for plastic products. Scientists have continued to find new applications for plastics in products such as compact discs, CDs, computer diskettes, outdoor furniture, and personal computers, PCs. The material has become essential to modern life.
When did department stores begin?
Department stores, which offer a wide variety of goods for sale in various departments, emerged in the mid-1800s. Many evolved out of general stores, which offered a variety of goods but not divided into departments, while others evolved out of dry goods stores, which sold textiles and related merchandise. The first bona fide department store was established in Paris, the Bon Marché, French meaning good bargain. Opened its doors in 1838. Between the 1850s and 1880s, numerous department stores opened in American cities including Jordan Marsh, founded 1851 in Boston, Massachusetts. R. H. Macy's, founded 1858 in New York City, the store was known for its creative advertisements. Wanamaker's, founded 1861 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It successfully implemented fixed pricing so that customers no longer haggled over price, and Marshall Field, founded 1881 in Chicago. Within 25 years it became the world's largest wholesale and retail dry goods store. These pioneer department stores, multi-storied enterprises located in downtown areas, introduced many innovations to merchandising, including the policy of returnable or exchangeable goods, ready-made apparel, clearly marked prices, and window displays. By the early 1900s, department stores could be found throughout the country. The timing was right for their emergence. Urban centers grew rapidly at the end of the century, giving department stores a ready clientele. The advent of the telephone, electric lighting, and billing machines helped retailers conduct business efficiently. Transportation improvements allowed for the shipment of large quantities of goods, and a variety of finished goods were mass-produced, increasing supply and lowering cost of production as well as the price to the consumer. By the 1910s, the stores were part of a new mass culture, which centered in American cities. During the 20th century, department store sales typically ranged between 6 and 12% of total annual retail sales.
How were finished goods produced before the Industrial Revolution?
Before the factory and machine age ushered in by the Industrial Revolution, people made many of their own finished goods, bought them from small-scale producers, who manufactured the goods largely by hand, or bought them from merchants who contracted home workers to produce goods. The putting out system was a production method that was used in New England from the mid-1700s to the early 1800s. It worked this way: merchants supplied raw materials, cotton, for example, to families, especially women and young girls, who would make partially finished goods. Thread, or fully finished goods, cloth, for the merchant. These manufactured goods were then sold by the merchant. Home workers, who put out goods, provided the needed manufacturing labor of the day.
Why were the Rosenbergs tried?
Husband and wife Julius, 1918 to 1953, and Ethel Rosenberg, 1915 to 1953, were tried for conspiracy to commit wartime espionage. Arrested in 1950, the Rosenbergs were charged with passing nuclear weapons data to the Soviets, enabling the Communists to develop and explode their own atomic bomb, an event that had been announced to the American public by President Truman on September 23, 1949. As the realization set in that the United States could now be the victim of an atomic attack, the anxieties of the Cold War heightened.
When did diamond mining begin in Africa?
And 1867 discovery of a pretty pebble along the banks of the Orange River. in South Africa led to the finding of a rich diamond field near present-day Kimberley. The city was founded as a result of the mining, in 1871. Similar to the California gold rush roughly a decade and a half earlier. The finding in central South Africa prompted people from Britain and other countries to flock to the area. However, the ultimate outcome was conflict, since both the British and the Boers, who were Dutch descendants living in South Africa, claimed the Kimberley area. The First Boer War ensued in 1880.
What is the Sherman Antitrust Act?
Passed by Congress in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was an attempt to break up corporate trusts. Combinations of firms or corporations formed to limit competition and monopolize a market. The legislation stated that every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in the restraint of trade is illegal. While the act made clear that anyone found to be in violation of restraining trade would face fines, jail terms, and the payment of damages. The language lacked clear definitions of what exactly constituted restraint of trade. The nation's courts were left with the responsibility of interpreting the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the justices proved as reluctant to take on big business as Congress had been. The legislation was introduced in Congress by Senator John Sherman, 1823-1900, of Ohio. In response to increasing outcry from state governments and the public for the passage of national antitrust laws. Many states had passed their own antitrust bills or had made constitutional provisions prohibiting trusts. But the statutes proved difficult to enforce and big business found ways around them. When the legislation proposed by Sherman reached the Senate, conservative congressmen rewrote it. Many charged that the senators had made it deliberately vague. In the decade after its passage, the federal government prosecuted only 18 antitrust cases and court decisions did little to break up monopolies. But after the turn of the century, a progressive spirit in the nation grew. Among progressive reformers' demands was that government regulate business. In 1911 the U.S. Justice Department won key victories against monopolies, breaking up John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company of New Jersey and James B. Duke's American Tobacco Company. The decision set a precedent for how the Sherman Antitrust Act would be enforced and demonstrated a national intolerance toward monopolistic trade practices. In 1914, national antitrust legislation was strengthened by the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, which outlawed price fixing, the practice of pricing below cost to eliminate a competitive product, made it illegal for the same executives to manage two or more competing companies, a practice called interlocking directorates, and prohibited any corporation from owning stock in a competing corporation. The creation of the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, that same year provided further insurance that U.S. corporations engaging in unfair practices would be investigated by the government. Between 1880 and the early 1900s, corporate trusts proliferated in the United States, becoming powerful business forces. The vague language of the Sherman antitrust legislation and the court's reluctance to prosecute big business based on that act did little to break up the monopolistic giants. The tide turned against corporate trusts when Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, became president in September 1901, after President William McKinley, 1843 to 1901, was assassinated. Roosevelt launched a trust-busting campaign, initiating, through the Attorney General's office, some 40 lawsuits against American corporations such as American Tobacco Company, Standard Oil Company, and American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T. Government efforts to break up the monopolies were strengthened in 1914, during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. 1856 to 1924, when Congress passed the Clayton antitrust legislation and created the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, which is responsible for keeping business competition free and fair. Trust busting declined during the prosperity of the 1920s, but was again vigorously pursued in the 1930s. During the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945.
Who was tried at Nuremberg?
Following World War II, 1939 to 45. 22 leaders of Nazi Germany were put on trial at Nuremberg's Palace of Justice. The International Military Tribunal began the proceedings on November 25, 1945, and they were not concluded until September 30 of the following year. The verdicts were announced on October 1. The site was deliberately selected by the Allies. The now bombed-out city of Nuremberg was considered a seat of Nazi power, though many, including Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, 1979 to 1953, thought that Hitler's henchmen ought only to be tried as a show of justice before they were executed. Others, notably U.S. Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson, 1892 to 1954, believed due process of law must be observed. The American view prevailed. The tribunal indicted 23 Nazi leaders on 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. One of the defendants, Robert Ley, 1890 to 1945, committed suicide in prison before the trial began. The case against the Nazis was based on a mountain of written evidence, such as orders, reports, manifests, logs, letters, and diaries. The Germans had scrupulously recorded their evil deeds. The presentation of the documents was punctuated with live testimony of a German civilian contractor who, out of curiosity, had followed a Nazi detachment to an embankment where several thousand Jewish men, women, and children were shot and buried in a pit, and of a French woman, a survivor of the horrors of Auschwitz, recollecting a night when children had been hurled into furnaces alive, since the Nazis had run out of fuel. The atrocities were rendered unimaginably horrific by the sheer number of Nazi victims, which included 3.7 million, of the 5.7 million captured, Soviet troops who died in prison. 4 million Jews who died in extermination camps, and the murder of at least 2 million more Jews elsewhere. The defense was prohibited from employing a "you did it, too" argument, which would have been an attempt to justify their actions by claiming it was all part of war. The Allies were determined to bring the Nazis to justice for their appalling and diabolical acts. Among those tried at Nuremberg were Hitler's chief deputy Hermann Göring. 1893 to 1946, whom a New Yorker correspondent covering the trials described as a brain without a conscience. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, 1893 to 1946, and Armaments Minister Albert Speer, 1905 to 1981. Göring and Ribbentrop were among the 5 men found guilty on all 4 counts against them. They were sentenced to hang. 6 others were found guilty of crimes against humanity and were all sentenced to hang. A 7th man, Martin Bormann, 1900 to 45, who had been tried in absentia, was also sentenced to hang if he were found to be alive. 7 others were also found guilty on 1 or 2 counts and were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. 3 were acquitted on all 4 counts. Göring escaped his hanging, though he was to be closely monitored by his jailers. He managed to secure a vial of cyanide, which he swallowed a few hours before his scheduled execution. Since Bormann was at large, 10 Nazis died in the 3 gallows that had been constructed in the prison gym of the Palace of Justice. The trials at Nuremberg cemented the principle that wartime leaders are accountable under international law for their crimes and immoralities.
What is King Cotton?
King Cotton was an expression of the mid-1800s, when cotton had become so vital to the economies of southern states that it was said to rule them. Until the 1790s, growers were limited to producing the quantity of cotton that could be processed by slaves. Separating cotton's fibers from its seeds was a time-consuming and labor-intensive process. The bolls were dried in front of a fire, and the seeds were picked out by hand. In 1793, American inventor Eli Whitney, 1765 to 1825, introduced the cotton gin. In one day, his machine could clean 50 times as much cotton fiber than could a manual laborer. While Whitney patented the machine in 1794, imitations were nevertheless quickly put into production by shrewd businessmen who observed the effect the gin could have on the nation's cotton industry. There was no shortage of demand for the fiber. Just before Whitney developed the gin, another inventor, British-born Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835, built the first successful water-powered machines for spinning cotton, which he introduced at a Rhode Island mill in 1790. As the 1800s dawned, machinery had made cotton the center of the nation's emerging textiles industry. Growers in the South stepped up cotton production to keep up with factories' demands. Slave labor and excellent growing conditions in the southern states, predominantly Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, combined to dramatically increase production. By 1849, cotton exports reached $66 million a year and accounted for roughly 2/5 of total U.S. exports. But cotton came at a dear price. While laborers in the North's textile factories worked under difficult and sometimes dangerous circumstances, in the South cotton crops were planted and harvested by slaves. As abolitionists became increasingly vocal about the immorality of slavery and demanded the U.S. government legislate the abolition of slavery, Southern growers defended the system. Knowing that their livelihoods and the South's economy depended on it. In 1858, Senator James Henry Hammond, 1807–1864, of South Carolina taunted Northern sympathizers, saying, "You dare not make war on cotton, no power on earth dares make war upon it. Cotton is king." Hammond was not the first to use the phrase, it was coined 3 years earlier in the title of a book. Cotton's importance to the South contributed to the deepening North-South divide in the nation. By the time the Civil War, 1861–65, began, the southern United States supplied 2/3 of the world's cotton.
When was Microsoft founded?
It wasn't all that long ago, 1975, that computer whiz Bill Gates, 1955. Founded what is now the dominant manufacturer of computer software. So dominant that the company has faced antitrust allegations from the federal government. Gates was only 19 years old when he founded the business with his friend Paul Gardner Allen. And he had dropped out of Harvard to do so. It paid off. Gates was a billionaire by age 30. Though he's undoubtedly a math ace. He scored a perfect 800 in math on his SATs and began writing computer programs when he was all of 13. Gates has more than once credited the success of Microsoft to not his own programming skills but to hiring the best programming talent for the Redmond, Washington-based company.
Why was the introduction of canning important?
The advent of canned foods not only created an industry, but it altered the average American diet, helped usher in the consumer age, and saved time. Canning, a process for preserving food, vegetables, fruits, meats, and fish, by heating and sealing it in airtight containers, was developed by French candy maker Nicolas-François Appert, c. 1750–1841, in 1809, though he did not understand why the process worked. Some 50 years later, the pioneering work of French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur, 1822–1895, explained that heating is necessary to the canning process since it kills bacteria, microorganisms, that would otherwise spoil the food. Canning was introduced to American consumers in stages. In 1821 the William Underwood Company began a canning operation in Boston, Massachusetts. In the 1840s oyster canning began in Baltimore, Maryland. In 1853 American inventor Gale Borden. 1801 to 1874, developed a way to condense and preserve milk in a can, founding the Borden Company 4 years later. And in 1858 American inventor John Landis Mason, 1832 to 1902, developed a glass jar and lid suited to home canning. Though early commercial canning methods did not ensure a safe product and many American women avoided the convenience foods, the canning industry grew rapidly. At least in part due to the male market, which included cowboys in the West. Between 1860 and 1870 the U.S. canning industry increased output from 5 million to 30 million cans. Improvements in the process during the 1870s helped eliminate the chance that cans would burst. A problem early on. And though the canning process changes food flavor, color, and texture, the convenience and long shelf life of canned foods helped them catch on. By the end of the 1800s a wide variety of canned foods, which had also come down in price, were common to the urban American diet. Companies such as Franco-American advertised in women's magazines, promoting their delicacies in tins. An outbreak of botulism in the 1920s prompted the American canning industry to make further improvements to its process.
When did the American cattle industry begin?
As a large-scale commercial endeavor. The beef industry had its beginnings in the decades following the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. Longhorn cattle, a breed of cattle descended from cows and bulls left by early Spanish settlers in the American Southwest, spurred the growth of the industry. Named for their long horns, which span about 4 feet, by the 1860s they had multiplied and great numbers of them roamed freely across the open range of the West. Ranchers in Texas bred the Longhorns with other cattle breeds such as Hereford and Angus to produce quality meat. With beef in demand in the eastern United States, shrewd businessmen capitalized on the business opportunity, buying cattle for $3 to $5 a head and selling them in eastern and northern markets for as much as $25 to $60 a head. Ranchers hired cowboys to round up, sort out, and drive their herds to railheads in places like Abilene and Dodge City, Kansas, which became famous as cowtowns. Raucous boomtowns where saloons and brothels proliferated. After the long trail drive, the cattle were loaded onto rail cars and shipped live to local butchers who slaughtered the livestock and prepared the beef. For a 20-year period the plentiful longhorn cattle sustained a booming livestock industry in the West. At least 6 million Texas Longhorns were driven across Oklahoma to the cow towns of Kansas. By 1890 the complexion of the industry changed. Farmers and ranchers in the West used a new material, barbed wire, to fence in their lands. Closing the open range, railroads were extended, bringing an end to the long, hard, and much glorified cattle drives. The role of the cowboy changed, making him little more than a hired hand, and big business took over the industry. Among the entrepreneurs who capitalized on beef's place in the American diet was New England-born Gustavus Swift. 1839 to 1903, who in 1877 began a large-scale slaughterhouse operation in Chicago, shipping ready-packed meat via refrigerated rail cars to markets in the East.
What was the tariff of abominations?
In 1828 the U.S. Congress passed a bill putting high tariffs, government taxes, on imported goods. The measure was intended to protect the burgeoning industries of New England, where numerous factories had opened during the first 3 decades of the century, and the manufacture of finished goods defined the region's economy. Congress figured that by placing high taxes on goods from other countries, Americans would buy American-made products. But Southern farmers had come to rely on cheaper imported goods. Believing the 1828 legislation was overly protective of the nation's industrial interests, Southerners dubbed it the Tariff of Abominations. Vice President John C. Calhoun, 1782 to 1850, from South Carolina, openly and strongly criticized the tax, pronouncing that any state could declare null a federal law it deemed unconstitutional. In response, Congress took measures to lower the tariffs, but not eliminate them. South Carolina remained dissatisfied with the legislation, and in 1832 the state declared the Tariff Act null and void. Further, it threatened secession from the Union. President Andrew Jackson, 1767 to 1845, unwilling to tolerate such rebelliousness, and determined to enforce the federal law at all costs, asked Congress to pass the force bill legislation allowing the nation's armed forces to collect the tariffs. Jackson's move inspired tremendous opposition in Congress. The Senate leader of the anti-Jackson contingency was Henry Clay, 1777 to 1852, of Kentucky. Clay, who had earned himself the nickname Great Pacificator for his work in crafting the Missouri Compromise, 1820, presented another compromise in 1833. He proposed that duties on certain goods could remain high but others should be gradually reduced over time. The compromise tariff authored by Clay averted an all-out conflict in the nation. The measure was passed and thereafter tariffs were adjusted depending on the prevailing economic conditions. But the fury over the Tariff of Abominations further revealed the North-South differences and the federal government versus states' rights issues that would inspire the Southern states led by South Carolina to secede from the Union in 1860 and 1861, bringing on the American Civil War, 1861–65.
Why did the auto industry boom in the post-war era?
In the years following World War II, 1939–45, auto ownership in the United States soared. From 27.5 million registered vehicles in 1940 to 61.5 million in 1960. Americans had resumed their love affair with the automobile, inextricably linking the car with the U.S. history of the post-war era. Many factors combined to bring about the automobile's widespread popularity. During World War II, the car manufacturers curtailed auto production, converting factories to military production and turning out some $29 billion in materials, including trucks, jeeps, tanks, aircraft, engines, artillery, and ammunition. With the conflict ended, automakers stepped up production to fulfill the unmet demand of the war years, and soon found themselves working to meet new demand, created by an increase in consumer spending and the growth of the suburbs. The overall prosperity of the late 1940s and 1950s produced a new spirit of consumerism. Government regulations, brought about through the efforts of the labor unions, resulted in increased wages and improved benefits, meaning Americans, for the most part, had more disposable income. Advertisers took advantage of the new medium of television to reach wide and eager audiences. The housing industry, largely dormant during World War II, built new neighborhoods around the edges of American cities, making the automobile a necessity rather than a luxury. The Big Three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, increased capacity to meet the tremendous demand, setting new records for production in 1949 and 1950. By 1960, more than 3 out of every 4 American families owned at least one car. The infrastructure raced to keep pace with a nation on wheels. Superhighways were built, covering some 10,000 miles of road. Motels and fast food restaurants went up along roadsides, and shopping centers were built outside city centers. While imports would challenge the American automakers in the decades to come, it was the U.S. manufacturers that defined the post-war era.
Who was Rosie the Riveter?
The term referred to the American women who worked factory jobs as part of the war effort on the home front, where auto plants and other industrial facilities were converted into defense plants to manufacture airplanes, ships, and weapons. As World War II, 1939–45, wore on, more and more men went overseas to fight, resulting in a shortage of civilian male workers. And so, women pitched in. However, at the end of the war, many of these women were displaced as the men returned home to their jobs and civilian life. Nevertheless, the contribution of all the Rosie the Riveters was instrumental to the war effort.
What was the monkey trial?
The July 1925 trial of Dayton, Tennessee, public school teacher John T. Scopes, 1900-1970, was dubbed the monkey trial because at issue was Scopes's teaching of evolution in his classroom. Having yielded to religious beliefs in creationism, the story of human origins told in the Bible's book of Genesis. Tennessee state law prohibited teaching public school students about the theories of English naturalist Charles Darwin, 1809–1882. Darwin's scientifically credible work The Origin of Species argued that humans had descended from ape-like creatures. Celebrated attorney Clarence Darrow, 1857–1938, defended Scopes. Lawyer and former presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, 1860–1925, known as the Great Commoner, argued the prosecution. For 12 days in the summer of 1925, the small town in eastern Tennessee became the site of a showdown between modern scientific thought and traditional fundamentalism. Or as some observed, between cosmopolitan and rural America. Spectators crowded the courtroom, eventually forcing the proceedings to be moved to the courthouse lawn. Journalists issued daily reports, which were published in newspapers across the country. It was headline writers who dubbed the case the monkey trial. Darrow made history when he called Bryan himself to the stand. It was a daring move on the defense attorney's part. But since Bryan eagerly accepted the summons, the judge allowed the questioning. Darrow first got Bryan to agree that every word in the Bible is true. Then he set in to reveal the hazards of such a literal interpretation, asking, for example, how Cain had found himself a wife if he, Adam, Eve, and Abel were the only 4 people on earth at the time. Darrow succeeded in shaking the prosecutor, who finally admitted that he did not believe Earth was made in 6 days. Bryan retaliated by accusing Darrow of insulting the Bible, to which Darrow replied, I am examining you on your fool ideas that no Christian on earth believes. It was drama better than any novelist could write. Darrow lost the case, which was later overturned on a technicality. Scopes had only been charged a $100 fine for violating the state law, which was repealed in 1967. But the trial, preserved in the play and film Inherit the Wind, is still remembered today. Scopes's crime was not sensational, his trial did not break any legal ground. And the defense had not won a brilliant victory, but the proceedings, carried out in the midsummer heat of the American South, epitomized the era and, ultimately, made for a great story.
What was Al Capone tried for?
Notorious American gangster Alphonse Scarface Al Capone, 1899 to 1947. Whose crime syndicate terrorized Chicago in the 1920s, was brought to trial for income tax evasion. After Chicago police had been unable to bring Capone to justice for his criminal activities, which included trafficking bootleg liquor, gambling, prostitution, and murder, the Federal Bureau of Investigation determined that the only way to prosecute the crime boss would be through violation of the tax laws. For 2.5 weeks in October 1931, the case against Capone was heard in a Chicago courtroom. He was found guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion, sentenced to 11 years in prison, and charged $50,000 in fines and $30,000 in court costs. While his first jail cell, in Illinois' Cook County Jail, allowed him the luxuries of a private shower, phone conversations, telegrams, and even visits by other gangsters, including Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz. Capone was eventually moved to Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, where he received no privileges. Released in 1939, Capone lived out his remaining years with his wife and son in Miami Beach, where he was reportedly haunted by imaginary killers.
What was the dot-com bubble?
The dot-com bubble was a phenomenon of the late 1990s, when there was unguarded optimism for internet-based businesses. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a bubble has long been defined as anything fragile, unsubstantial, empty, or worthless, since the 17th century. The word has been applied to delusive commercial or financial schemes. .com refers to a commercial internet venture, which most often carries the .com suffix in its URL, or internet address. The .com bubble inflated quickly. The graphical user interface, GUI, of the World Wide Web, with point-and-click hyperlinks, was integrated into the previously academic-oriented Internet in the early 1990s, making it more user-friendly for the average person. Public use of the Internet expanded rapidly. Existing businesses realized they needed a presence on the Internet for information or marketing purposes, if not for commerce. The promise of conducting business online, where costs were wrongly judged to be low, spurred entrepreneurs. New businesses began popping up to take advantage of the commercial or e-commerce possibilities of the net. These were the start-ups. They often had no real-world, or bricks-and-mortar, correlation. They strived to make money by reaching consumers only over the Internet. Among the start-ups of the .com bubble were Amazon, eBay, eGois, WebMD, HotJobs, and Monster. Startups were known by several characteristics, because of investor optimism about e-commerce. Startups had quick access to venture capital funds, their managers were usually young, risk-taking Genzers, some of whom were unsalaried workers who signed on for the promise of big earnings through stock options. They spent lavishly on their office spaces and on employee perks. They conducted expensive advertising and marketing campaigns. And, when taken public on the stock market, in an IPO, or initial public offering, the original owners and investors were known to make huge amounts of money, at least on paper. Once the dot-coms were on the stock market, the technology-heavy Nasdaq was home to many. Individual investors became enchanted with them, artificially inflating their stock prices, even when many companies had yet to earn a dime. The price-to-earnings ratio, or PE, a measure of performance used by investors, became virtually meaningless when applied to the dot-coms. The height of the dot-com bubble was the January 2000 Super Bowl, when almost 20 dot-com companies paid more than $2 million each for prime advertising spots. On March 10, 2000, the Nasdaq index of leading technology peaked at 5,048.62. A year earlier the index was less than half that. Right around 2,500, and a year later it hovered around 2,000, or about 40% of its peak. In spring 2005 the Nasdaq Composite Index was below 2,000. Some called the March 2000 burst cataclysmic, but other analysts and investors saw the end of the dot-com bubble as a necessary correction, or thinning, after which earnest players could get on with building internet-based businesses that would be successful in the long run. Whatever the view, the dot-com bubble was the biggest market bubble ever seen, and many investors lost big.
What was the dot-com bubble?
The dot-com bubble was a phenomenon of the late 1990s, when there was unguarded optimism for internet-based businesses. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a bubble has long been defined as anything fragile, unsubstantial, empty, or worthless, since the 17th century. The word has been applied to delusive commercial or financial schemes. .com refers to a commercial internet venture, which most often carries the .com suffix in its URL, or internet address. The .com bubble inflated quickly. The graphical user interface, GUI, of the World Wide Web, with point-and-click hyperlinks, was integrated into the previously academic-oriented Internet in the early 1990s, making it more user-friendly for the average person. Public use of the Internet expanded rapidly. Existing businesses realized they needed a presence on the Internet for information or marketing purposes, if not for commerce. The promise of conducting business online, where costs were wrongly judged to be low, spurred entrepreneurs. New businesses began popping up to take advantage of the commercial or e-commerce possibilities of the net. These were the start UPS. They often had no real-world, or bricks-and-mortar, correlation. They strived to make money by reaching consumers only over the Internet. Among the start UPS of the dot-com bubble were Amazon, eBay, eToys, WebMD, HotJobs, and Monster. Startups were known by several characteristics, because of investor optimism about e-commerce. Startups had quick access to venture capital funds, their managers were usually young, risk-taking Genzers, some of whom were unsalaried workers who signed on for the promise of big earnings through stock options. They spent lavishly on their office spaces and on employee perks, they conducted expensive advertising and marketing campaigns. And, when taken public on the stock market, in an IPO, or initial public offering, the original owners and investors were known to make huge amounts of money, at least on paper. Once the dot-coms were on the stock market, the technology-heavy Nasdaq was home to many. Individual investors became enchanted with them, artificially inflating their stock prices, even when many companies had yet to earn a dime. The price-to-earnings ratio, or PE, a measure of performance used by investors, became virtually meaningless when applied to the dot-coms. The height of the dot-com bubble was the January 2000 Super Bowl, when almost 20 dot-com companies paid more than $2 million each for prime advertising spots. On March 10, 2000, the Nasdaq index of leading technology peaked at 5,048.62. A year earlier the index was less than half that. Right around 2,500, and a year later it hovered around 2,000, or about 40% of its peak. In spring 2005 the Nasdaq Composite Index was below 2,000. Some called the March 2000 burst cataclysmic, but other analysts and investors saw the end of the dot-com bubble as a necessary correction, or thinning, after which earnest players could get on with building internet-based businesses that would be successful in the long run. Whatever the view, the dot-com bubble was the biggest market bubble ever seen, and many investors lost big.
What was Y2K?
Y2K means year 2000, K is a metric abbreviation for thousand. In the late 1990s the term was most often coupled with problem or bug to refer to a potentially disastrous computer programming peculiarity. Over decades of programming and in trillions of lines of code, developers had truncated the 4-digit year to 2 digits as a space-saving mechanism, so that 1999 was rendered as 99. It was therefore feared that many computer programs, as well as simple chips in VCRs, watches, and other consumer devices, might malfunction, reading 00 not as 2000 but as 1900, or not recognize it at all. The problem was a concern for every sector of the global economy, but it was feared to have a particularly ruinous impact on the mainframe computer systems that are the backbone of operations for banks and other financial institutions. Electric utilities, water systems, communication systems, oil and gas companies, and government entities, such as the Department of Defense and the Social Security Administration. In the second half of the 1990s, business and government developed solutions to the Y2K problem. or the millennial bug, readiness was gauged periodically. To encourage the sharing of best practices across and between industries. The federal government passed the year 2000 Information and Readiness Disclosure Act, signed October 1998. Despite assurances that the Y2K bug had been fixed, much of the public met the year 2000 with at least a bit of trepidation, some people having made emergency preparations, such as stocking up on food and water, buying generators, and stashing away cash. Though there were isolated glitches, no major problem surfaced. Thanks to rectification efforts, the foretold Y2K crisis never materialized. But the cost of fixing the problem was high. It had an estimated $1.5 trillion price tag.
What was Y2K?
Y2K means year 2000, K is a metric abbreviation for thousand. In the late 1990s the term was most often coupled with problem or bug to refer to a potentially disastrous computer programming peculiarity. Over decades of programming and in trillions of lines of code, developers had truncated the 4-digit year to 2 digits as a space-saving mechanism, so that 1999 was rendered as 99. It was therefore feared that many computer programs, as well as simple chips in VCRs, watches, and other consumer devices, might malfunction, reading 00 not as 2000 but as 1900, or not recognize it at all. The problem was a concern for every sector of the global economy, but it was feared to have a particularly ruinous impact on the mainframe computer systems that are the backbone of operations for banks and other financial institutions, electric utilities, water systems, communication systems, oil and gas companies, and government entities, such as the Department of Defense and the Social Security Administration. In the second half of the 1990s, business and government developed solutions to the Y2K problem, or the millennial bug. Readiness was gauged periodically. To encourage the sharing of best practices across and between industries, the federal government passed the year 2000 Information and Readiness Disclosure Act, signed October 1998. Despite assurances that the Y2K bug had been fixed, much of the public met the year 2000 with at least a bit of trepidation, some people having made emergency preparations, such as stocking up on food and water, buying generators, and stashing away cash. Though there were isolated glitches, no major problem surfaced. Thanks to rectification efforts, the foretold Y2K crisis never materialized. But the cost of fixing the problem was high. It had an estimated $1.5 trillion price tag.
What was Enron?
Enron was a high-flying energy trading and communications company headquartered in Houston, Texas. It was the 7th largest corporation in the United States, a favorite on Wall Street. And for 6 years in a row, 1996 to 2001, was named America's Most Innovative Company by Fortune magazine. Then Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in December 2001. Rocking the business world and shocking investors and rank-and-file employees. It was, for a short time, the largest bankruptcy in American history. Federal investigators later learned that the company's collapse was caused by fraudulent accounting practices that allowed Enron to overstate earnings and hide debts. The conglomerate had booked billions in profits that did not really exist and created mythical companies to bury heavy losses. Enron's stock price plummeted, there were massive layoffs, employee retirement accounts heavily invested in Enron stock were decimated, executives resigned, and criminal indictments followed. Its accounting firm, Chicago-based Arthur Andersen, collapsed under the weight of its involvement in the scandal. Enron soon became emblematic of a much larger problem, the so-called breakdown of corporate America. It was the first of several colossal business failures, the biggest of which was the collapse of telecom giant WorldCom. In July 2002, WorldCom, valued at $180 billion and serving 15 million customers at its 1999 peak, filed for bankruptcy. WorldCom eclipsed Enron to earn the dubious title of largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. Again, fraudulent business practices were to blame. In March 2005, a federal jury convicted former WorldCom Inc. CEO Bernard Ebbers of engineering $11 billion in fraud. He was also found guilty of conspiracy and of filing false financial reports. The conviction was critical to prosecutors in a host of pending cases connected to corporate scandals, including Enron, whose former chairman, Kenneth Lay, and former CEO, Tom Skilling, were awaiting trial, set for 2006. A Fortune magazine writer reflected on the crisis of corporate ethics, saying, "Phony earnings, inflated revenues, conflicted Wall Street analysts, directors asleep at the switch. This isn't just a few bad apples, it is a systemic breakdown." Enron happened to be first, and it became the symbol for the many. In 2005, Enron was in the process of distributing remaining assets to creditors and liquidating other operations. WorldCom, meanwhile, emerged from bankruptcy in 2004 as MCI Inc., the name of one of its subsidiaries.
What was Enron?
Enron was a high-flying energy trading and communications company headquartered in Houston, Texas. It was the seventh largest corporation in the United States, a favorite on Wall Street. And for 6 years in a row, 1996 to 2001, was named America's Most Innovative Company by Fortune magazine. Then Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in December 2001. Rocking the business world and shocking investors and rank-and-file employees. It was, for a short time, the largest bankruptcy in American history. Federal investigators later learned that the company's collapse was caused by fraudulent accounting practices that allowed Enron to overstate earnings and hide debts. The conglomerate had booked billions in profits that did not really exist and created mythical companies to bury heavy losses. Enron's stock price plummeted, there were massive layoffs, employee retirement accounts heavily invested in Enron stock were decimated, executives resigned, and criminal indictments followed. Its accounting firm, Chicago-based Arthur Andersen, collapsed under the weight of its involvement in the scandal. Enron soon became emblematic of a much larger problem, the so-called breakdown of corporate America. It was the first of several colossal business failures, the biggest of which was the collapse of telecom giant WorldCom. In July 2002, WorldCom, valued at $180 billion and serving 15 million customers at its 1999 peak, filed for bankruptcy. WorldCom eclipsed Enron to earn the dubious title of largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. Again, fraudulent business practices were to blame. In March 2005, a federal jury convicted former WorldCom Inc. CEO Bernard Ebbers of engineering $11 billion in fraud. He was also found guilty of conspiracy and of filing false financial reports. The conviction was critical to prosecutors in a host of pending cases connected to corporate scandals, including Enron, whose former chairman, Kenneth Lay, and former CEO, Tom Skilling, were awaiting trial, set for 2006. A Fortune magazine writer reflected on the crisis of corporate ethics, saying, "Phony earnings, inflated revenues, conflicted Wall Street analysts, directors asleep at the switch. This isn't just a few bad apples, it is a systemic breakdown." Enron happened to be first, and it became the symbol for the many. In 2005, Enron was in the process of distributing remaining assets to creditors and liquidating other operations. WorldCom, meanwhile, emerged from bankruptcy in 2004 as MCI Inc., the name of one of its subsidiaries.